Hey everybody, Matthew Perry here, and I want to welcome all of you to All Around Spurgeon. This is our third episode of our relaunch of this particular podcast. You may see another All Around Spurgeon that is floating around on Spotify, and that was an old one that I did, but Anchor and Spotify changed some things up, and I can't figure out how to remove it and put it onto this new one. So there's All Around Spurgeon, but the one that we're doing here is the All Around Spurgeon podcast. Sorry for any confusion, but here we are. Here we are. And this is on June the 19th. And what an important day this is for those who are Spurgeonites, Spurgeonistas, Spurgeon scholars. Because June 19th, 1834 was the day that Spurgeon was born. He was born in a rural outpost in Kelvedon, Essex, in England. And he came from good stock. I mean, he really came from good stock. Both his father, his grandfather, and generations back were all preachers. They were all dissenting preachers, whether they were Congregationalists or Spurgeon, who would become a Baptist. And but so when you were preaching as a dissenting preacher, you were preaching outside of the authority of the Anglican Church, and you could be thrown into jail. And Spurgeon would often refer to his dissenting DNA that was passed down to him, and he was grateful for that. And of course, when you think about his favorite author and his favorite book, John Bunyan, and that book, Pilgrim's Progress, well, if you know about Bunyan, he spent 12 years in a Bedford, England jail because he was preaching the gospel and refused to preach anything else, but it was outside of the auspices of the Anglican Church, thus the 12 years in jail. And so Spurgeon would read about him and learn about him and hear about the adventures of his family and the preachers therein. And, he began to have this desire to just to preach the gospel, regardless of what other people, what other authorities, what any of those may be able to say. And I'm holding in my hands now, I actually have a copy of this All Around Spurgeon book that just came out a couple of weeks ago through Acoma Press. And I'm really grateful for them. And there's a chapter, a brief chapter in here about Spurgeon's family. In fact, the title of the first chapter is Like Nazareth of Olden Days, which which was actually a particular quote from a guy named W.Y. Fullerton, who was a biographer of Spurgeon. And listen to how he describes at the Essex County region that Spurgeon was born into. With its great hemisphere of sky, Essex, like Nazareth of olden days, lies near the stream of the world's traffic, but is shut off from it. And so this is where Spurgeon was. So you can imagine that someone who grew up in this, that where they were shut off from, civilization, and then God brings Spurgeon to the very center of civilization in London to be the pastor of the New Park Street Chapel, and then ultimately to be the pastor of the Metropolitan Tabernacle for 38 years until his death in 1892 at the age of 57. But as you read some of his sermons, Spurgeon, you can tell, held his family in such great esteem, even as he got older, that he wanted to make sure that he was passing it down to his twin boys, Thomas and Charles, both of whom went into the ministry. In fact, Thomas ended up pastoring some in England, yes, but then he went and pastored in at the Auckland Baptist Tabernacle in New Zealand. So the legacy that was passed down to Spurgeon and the legacy that Spurgeon passed down to his boys, we're still feeling the effects of this. In fact, I've got a number of shelves here. It's not like Ray Rhodes and some of those other fellows, but I'm getting a number of shelves here that are dedicated to Spurgeon's work. And it's not because we are having any kind of hagiographies towards Spurgeon. Not far from it. Spurgeon brings us to the throne of grace. Spurgeon brings us to Jesus. And every line that I read of his, every paragraph that I read of his, there is something there that I can certainly relate to. I was kind of raised in a rural area up until I was the age of 10 or 11, and many of Spurgeon's illustrations are rural in nature. So what a joy that is to be able, and it's no wonder that because of that heritage and that legacy, it's no wonder that the people in London began to understand him so well, because he was able to give those illustrations. Yes, from a rural area. Yes, in a major city. I got it. But there were things that he was saying that was allowing people to understand the truths of Scripture more effectively, more devotionally. And it was a breath of fresh air, because there was a famine in the land. As Amos talks about, the prophet Amos talks about, there was a famine in the land. And Spurgeon brought him to the food, brought him to the bread of life, brought him to the living water. So June 19th, 1834. And for the next 57 years, God used him. God used him in so many different ways. And we can be grateful for that. So when you think about your birthday, think about your heritage, your legacy, what's been passed on to you, and what you can pass on to those that are after you. It's a great day for us to reflect and to be thankful that God put Spurgeon on the world stage like he did. All right, let me know if you have any questions, if there's anything you'd like for me to cover. But happy June 19th to all of you, and happy birthday to my pastor, Charles Spurgeon. God bless you all, everybody.